Imagine the Mediterranean coastline, 3,000 years ago. The smell of salt, rotting marine life, and wood smoke hangs heavy in the air. They have no land, no economy, and no permanent homes. Their clothing is practical, woven from raw wool or linen, frayed by the wind, represented the protective, overarching covering of Yahweh. God was offering them a visible anchor for their faith. He was saying, when you are tempted to fear the giants, when you are tempted to rebel, when you are inclined to follow your own wandering heart, look down. Remember whose covenant you belong to. You are covered. You are under my wing. This is not a story about a forgotten ritual. It is a story about a father desperately trying to keep his children close. That explains the corners. The garment was a wearable symbol of divine protection, but it still does not completely explain the impossible blue color of the thread itself. Why did the wing of the garment have to carry the violently expensive Tekhelet dye? To understand the blue dye, we have to leave the common tents of the Israelites and look at the only other person in the nation who wore it. If you walked through the Israelite camp in the wilderness, past the thousands of common tents, you would eventually reach the center. There, standing in stark contrast to the dust and the heat, was the tabernacle. It was the physical dwelling place of God on earth, and built to survive the harsh realities of the wilderness. They are a people defined by what they lack, and it is here, a structure of heavy curtains, bronze, and gold. And if you looked closely at the entrance, or if you were allowed to look inside at the veil separating the Holy of Holies, you would see a striking, familiar color. The sacred curtains were woven with gold, purple, scarlet, and Tekhelet, the exact same violently expensive blue. Now, look at the only man allowed to minister inside that sacred space. The high priest did not wear the rough wool of a shepherd. According to Exodus 28, his garments were sacred, designed for glory and for beauty. He wore an elaborate ephod, a jeweled breastpiece, and a seamless robe. And the biblical text is highly specific. The robe of the ephod was made entirely of Tekhelet, the sacred cord that bound the golden plate to his turban. Pressing the words, "Holy to the Lord," against his forehead, was also Tekhelet. In the ancient Israelite mind, this blue dye belonged exclusively to the realm of the holy. It was the color of the sanctuary. It was the color of the high priest. An ordinary Israelite was strictly forbidden from entering the holy place. To cross that boundary improperly, or to touch the sacred furniture, meant immediate death. The separation between the common people and the holy presence of God was absolute. In the 15th chapter of Numbers, that God gives them a command that makes absolutely no historical or economic sense. He tells Moses to instruct the people. And yet, in Numbers 15, God takes the very color of the Holy of Holies and commands that it be tied to the hem of every ordinary person in the camp. This was not merely a memory trick. It was a visual earthquake. A common laboree, whose hands were calloused from gathering manna and hauling water, could look down at his frayed, dusty robe and see the exact same color that rested upon the shoulders of the high priest. By placing the blue cord on their garments, God was visually and legally fulfilling the staggering promise he had made earlier at Mount Sinai. "You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." This is the democratization of holiness. God was taking the sacred identity of the tabernacle and draping it over the shoulders of everyday people. When an Israelite looked at his hem, he did not just see a reminder of the law. He saw the color of the priesthood. He was reminded that while he might be a nomad wandering through a hostile wasteland, he was also an invited member of a royal, priestly kingdom. He carried a piece of the sanctuary wherever he walked. Once the pattern becomes visible, the entire weight of the command shifts. The blue thread was a wearable declaration of royal authority. It declared that they belonged to the king, that they were covered by his wing, to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations. And in every tassel, they are commanded to put a single cord of blue, and that their daily, ordinary lives were holy. This wearable theology became so deeply embedded in the national consciousness that it ceased to be just a religious symbol. It became the literal fabric of political power. The hem of the garment carried such intense authority that centuries later, the fate of Israel's throne would be decided by a knife cutting through one of these very corners. The pattern moves from a desert command to a royal cave in the days of King David. The air inside the cave at En-Gedi is damp and heavy. Outside, 3,000 of Israel's elite soldiers are hunting the countryside. Inside, a desperate fugitive and his men press themselves against the jagged limestone walls. Holding their breath in the darkness, King Saul has entered the cave alone, completely unaware that he has just walked into a trap. This is the scene in 1 Samuel 24. David has been running for his life for years. He has lost his home, his position, and his security. And now, the man trying to murder him is completely vulnerable, isolated in the dark. David's men whisper to him, urging him to strike. They tell him this is the moment God promised to deliver his enemy into his hand. David steps quietly out of the shadows. Most readers looking back at this command assume it was simply a strict religious uniform. We read the passage, and we see a visual memory aid. He raises his knife. But he does not strike the king. Instead, he reaches down and silently cuts off the corner of Saul's robe. To a modern reader, this seems like a bizarre, almost comical act of petty vandalism. We assume David is just trying to secure a physical piece of evidence to prove how close he was. But the biblical text tells us that immediately after David does this, he is struck by overwhelming, agonizing guilt. The scripture says, David's heart struck him. He turns to his men and declares, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed." Why such extreme guilt over a ruined piece of clothing? Because David did not just cut a piece of fabric. The Hebrew word used for the corner of Saul's robe is kanaf. David had severed the wing. In the ancient Near East, as we have seen, the hem of a garment was the physical extension of a man's identity, his authority, and his legal standing. But Saul was not just any man. He was the king of Israel. His kanaf would have borne the royal, priestly blue thread of Tekhelet, commanded in Numbers 15. That hem represented Saul's God-given authority to rule the covenant people. When David's knife sliced through the wool and severed the blue thread, he was making a devastating political and spiritual statement. He was symbolically tearing the kingdom away from Saul. He was attacking the Lord's anointed, a physical string tied to a garment to help an ancient people remember the 10 Commandments. We assume it is just another ancient rule. By seizing the royal identity for himself, David's profound guilt was not about destroying a garment. It was about trying to force the hand of God. He realized he had reached for the authority before God had handed it to him. He had attacked the very symbol of God's protective covering. This historical crisis proves how deeply the Israelites understood the theology of the hem. It was not a forgotten, dead tradition. It was a living, breathing symbol of total authority and holy identity. To hold the hem was to hold the covenant. The first appearance in the desert was a command. This appearance in the cave affected the fate of a nation. But the pattern is still not complete. If the blue thread represented the covering of God, the authority of the king, and the healing wings of the covenant, what happens when God in the flesh finally walks the earth? What happens when the true king arrives? Wearing this exact same garment? Centuries later, the same image returns. But this time, it is not a soldier holding a knife in the dark. It is a desperate woman reaching through a crowd, recognizing exactly what this blue thread means. The streets of Capernaum are choked with dust and noise. A massive crowd is crushing against Jesus as he moves toward the house of a dying girl. In the middle of this chaos, a woman is moving desperately through the dirt. For 12 years, she has suffered from a continuous hemorrhage. In a book filled with ancient rules, the familiar interpretation is not entirely wrong. It is incomplete. The problem is not that the verse is unclear. Under the Levitical law, her condition makes her perpetually unclean. She is a social outcast. bankrupt from failed medical treatments, and legally prohibited from being in this crowd. Everything she touches becomes defiled. If she brushes against a priest, he becomes unclean. If she touches a neighbor, they become unclean. But she does not ask Jesus to stop. She does not ask for a formal prayer. She simply reaches out from the ground. Most English Bibles translate this moment by saying she touched the hem or the edge of his garment. But the Gospel writers use a very specific Greek word to describe what she grasped, kraspedon. This is not a generic word for the bottom of a coat. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, kraspedon is the exact word used to translate the Hebrew tzitzit. It is the tassel. Jesus was an observant Jewish teacher. He did not wear the lavish, flowing robes of a Roman politician. He wore the ordinary garments of a faithful Israelite. As he walked through the crushing crowd, hanging from the four corners of his cloak was the blue thread of Numbers 15. The woman was not desperately grabbing a random piece of cloth. She was making a profound, calculated theological claim. The prophet Malachi had written a promise centuries earlier, looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. The problem is that we stop reading too early, and we fail to recognize the impossible weight of the color God demanded. But for you who fear my name, the Sun of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings. The Hebrew word used for wings in that prophecy was kanaf, the exact same word used for the corners of the garment that held the blue thread. She understood what the religious elite had forgotten. She recognized that the man walking through the dust was the true king. She recognized the ultimate high priest. And she knew that if she could just reach the kanaf, the protective, covenant wing of God, she would find refuge. When her trembling fingers grasped the blue thread, a shocking reversal of the ancient law occurred. Her impurity did not infect the high priest. Instead, his holy purity rushed into her broken body and healed her instantly. Jesus stops the entire procession. He turns to the terrified woman on the ground, and he calls her daughter. He brings her back into the family. He covers her with his wing. The blue thread did exactly what it was designed to do. It connected an outcast to the holy authority and healing presence of God. That would already be significant. But the story does not end there. If the tassel is so beautiful, and if Jesus himself wore it faithfully as an anchor of the covenant, why does he later publicly condemn the religious leaders for wearing them? God did not ask them to use a simple vegetable dye or a common thread. He specifically commanded Tekhelet. He commanded a nation of homeless wanderers. If the object is commanded by God, why does Jesus unleash some of his harshest criticism against the men who carefully attach it to their clothes? The answer exposes the deepest danger of wearing the royal identity. The physical command was beautiful, but human nature will always find a way to take a gift of grace and turn it into an instrument of pride. Near the end of his public ministry, Jesus stands in Jerusalem and issues a blisteringly clear warning to the crowds about the religious elite. In Matthew 23, he describes the Pharisees with a single, devastating critique. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. The English word translated as fringes is the Greek word kraspedon, the tassels, the blue thread. It is crucial to understand that Jesus is not condemning the tassels themselves. He faithfully wore them. He had just allowed a desperate, unclean woman to find miraculous healing by clinging to them. What Jesus condemns is not the law, but the distortion of the hem. Remember the original purpose of the command in the desert. God gave the blue thread to the Israelites as a deeply personal, internal anchor. He said, "It shall be a tassel for you to look at, living in tents and surviving on daily manna, to attach the wealth of emperors to their everyday clothes." Every single Israelite was ordered to wear the royal blue. And remember all the commandments. The thread was designed to catch the eye of the wearer. It was meant to stop an individual from wandering after their own heart. It was a mirror for the soul. But the Pharisees reversed the design. They lengthened the tassels. They made the blue threads massive, elaborate, and impossible to ignore as they swept across the stone floors of the synagogue. They did not wear the thread so they could look at it and remember God. They wore it so the crowds would look at it and remember how holy the Pharisees were. They took the democratized holiness of God, the royal blue that was meant to invite a nation of wanderers, into the priesthood and turned it into a boundary of social superiority. They used the symbol of the covenant to build a hierarchy. This exposes the deepest danger of carrying a royal identity. The object is completely useless if the heart does not reflect the king. The blue thread is not a magical talisman. A physical symbol cannot heal a rebellious spirit. If you wear the color of the sanctuary but your heart is filled with greed, control, and pride, the tassel is nothing more than a costume. The Pharisees wanted the visible status of the priesthood, but they refused the sacrificial love of the high priest. And this is where the history ends, and the question turns toward you. A laborer sits in the sun, cracking the shells of thousands of predatory sea snails. From each shattered shell, he carefully extracts a single, tiny gland. The detail is easy to miss, but it creates a massive historical contradiction. If this dye was practically impossible for commoners to afford, most of us do not walk through our cities wearing ancient garments with blue threads hanging from the corners. But the temptation of the Pharisee has not disappeared. It has only changed its wardrobe. We still construct elaborate public hymns. We still wear visible markers of our faith, our theology, our morality, and our spiritual disciplines. We carefully curate our public image. We want people to see how dedicated, how knowledgeable, or how righteous we are. We want the chief seats. But what is that outward appearance actually doing? What are you trying to project? And more importantly, what remains when external appearances disappear? When you are alone, in the quiet, in the middle of a failure or a season of waiting, what anchors you? Are you using your faith to project a public status, or is it an internal anchor pulling you back to obedience when you are prone to wander? This is not ultimately a story about religious performance. It is a story about internal condition. The Pharisees missed the true king because they were too busy demanding that everyone stare at their clothes. But this raises a final, unavoidable question. We no longer wear the physical blue cord on our clothing. The ancient laws of the tabernacle have been fulfilled. So, where does this leave us? The physical thread has been replaced, but the royal reality has only grown deeper. Why would God make it a non-negotiable law for every person? From the greatest elder to the poorest child? This is not ultimately a story. We no longer weave a physical blue thread into the edges of our clothing. The Apostle Peter explains why, writing to a scattered, persecuted group of early Christians. He does not tell them to alter their physical garments to prove their devotion to God. Instead, he tells them who they already are. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. The democratization of holiness that began in the heat of the Sinai desert is finally and fully realized in the new covenant. We do not need a blue cord hanging from a cloak to remind us of the law, because the Holy Spirit has written the covenant directly onto the human heart. We do not need a physical tassel to remind us of the sanctuary, because through the finished work of Jesus, his people have become the sanctuary. Step back and look at the breathtaking architecture of this story. What began as a command to remember God's laws in the aftermath of a national rebellion became a living, breathing covering. The blue thread was a wearable declaration of royal authority. It was the holy hem David was terrified to destroy in the dark of the cave. It was the healing wing that a desperate, unclean woman reached for in the dust of Capernaum. And it was the very covenant identity about ancient fashion and legalistic rules. It is a story about holding on to a royal identity in a world of exile and failure, that Jesus, the ultimate high priest, wore perfectly on our behalf. Return to the Mediterranean coastline where our journey began. Return to the intense heat, the crushing labor, the thousands of shattered shells, and the violently expensive Tekhelet dye. Remember the untouchable color of emperors, a color that commoners and slaves could never afford to touch, let alone wear. Now, look at yourself. We are the wanderers in the wilderness. We are the people prone to forget the promises of God, prone to fear the giants in front of us, and desperately inclined to follow our own wandering hearts. Left to ourselves, we have no spiritual economy. We could never afford the royal identity, required to stand in the holy presence of God. If our standing depended on our own religious performance, as the Pharisees believed, we would be wearing the frayed, ruined garments of exile forever. But the King of the universe did not leave us in the dust. He did not demand that we purchase our own purity. Instead, he stepped down into the dirt with us. He took the impossible, untouchable wealth of heaven and draped it over our frail shoulders. When Jesus went to the cross, he was stripped of his earthly garments and nailed to the wood so that you could be permanently clothed in his perfect righteousness. It is the story of a God who takes the untouchable wealth of heaven and binds it to the dusty garments of the unclean. He allowed his own body to be broken so that the boundary of your identity could be forever healed. This is not ultimately a story about an ancient religious uniform. It is a story about a God who refuses to let his people forget whose family they belong to. You are not defined by your wandering. You are not defined by the dust of your failures, your unseen suffering, or the spiritual poverty you feel in the quiet moments of your life. If you belong to Christ, you have been brought permanently under his wing. The King has placed his own royal signature upon you. You do not need to perform for the crowds to earn his love. You only need to reach out, even from the dirt, and hold on to the hem. But the mystery of the blue cord cannot be solved by looking at the color alone. To understand what this impossible dye was actually doing to the people who wore it, we have to look closely at exactly where it was placed. The string was not worn around the neck or tied to the wrist. It was attached to the lowest, most ordinary part of their clothing. And in the ancient Near East, that specific piece of fabric carried the power of life and death. To understand why the edge of a garment mattered so much, you have to forget how you buy clothes today. Today, clothing is mass-produced, easily replaced, and chosen for convenience. In the ancient Near East, a woven garment was a massive investment of time and labor. When the fluid inside that gland is first exposed to the air, it is almost clear. But as the coastal sun hits it, a violent chemical reaction occurs. It was a person's shelter against the wind, their blanket against the cold night, and often their most valuable physical possession. But the most important part of the garment was not the chest or the shoulders. It was the hem. If you walked into a bustling marketplace in ancient Mesopotamia, you would not need to ask for a man's rank, his social class, or his tribe. You would only need to look at the edge of his robe. The hem was an extension of a person's identity. It was their public signature. A king or a wealthy merchant would wear a garment with a heavy, elaborate, and intricately woven border. A servant, a laborer, or an outcast would wear a garment with a plain, frayed, or entirely missing hem. This was not just a matter of ancient fashion. It was a matter of law. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of ancient cuneiform tablets containing treaties, marriage contracts, and property deeds. When two men needed to finalize a binding legal agreement, they did not always sign their names or use a signet ring. Instead, they would take the edge of their clothing and press their hem firmly into the wet clay. That impression served as a legal seal. The hem represented the person. The fabric was the man. The liquid turns pale yellow, then a murky green, and finally, it settles into a brilliant, piercing blue. Because the hem carried this intense legal weight, to alter a person's hem was to alter their identity in the community. To inherit someone's mantle was to inherit their authority, and to cut off or damage a man's hem was to publicly strip him of his rank, to sever his social standing, and humiliate him. The edge of the garment was the absolute boundary of a person's honor. Now, bring that historical reality back to the desert of Sinai. When God tells Moses to instruct the Israelites to attach tassels to the corners of their garments, he is not just giving them a religious accessory. He is commanding them to permanently alter their public signature. And by requiring that specific thread of Tekhelet, the impossible, violently expensive blue dye of emperors. He is legally changing their status. He is taking a nation of former slaves, people who had spent generations making bricks in the mud of Egypt, and he is weaving the color of royalty into the very boundary of their identity. Every time an Israelite reached for their cloak, every time the wind blew across the camp, they would see the royal blue. They were wearing a daily, physical reminder of their elevated legal standing before the God of the universe. But this beautiful symbol creates another problem. If God is elevating them to royalty, if he is giving them a visual reminder of their high calling, this is Tekhelet. In the ancient world, it was not merely a color. It was a currency, because it required thousands of snails. The timing of the command seems completely out of place. We might expect God to give this brilliant blue thread when they crossed the Red Sea in victory, or when they stood at Mount Sinai receiving the law in glory. But that is not where this command appears. The Israelites are told to alter their hems. But we have to look closely at when God gives this command to understand what it actually meant. The placement of this law in the book of Numbers is not accidental. The timing holds the key to its deeper purpose, and the truth of what was happening in the camp right before this command is devastating. To understand the blue cord, you have to look at the dust and the despair that surrounded it. If you open the book of Numbers, chapter 15 can feel like a random collection of religious laws placed in the middle of a tragedy. Just 2 chapters earlier, the nation had finally reached the edge of the promised land. 12 spies went in to scout the territory, but 10 came back terrified of the giants. The entire camp collapsed into panic. They wept in their tents. They refused to trust God. And in a stunning act of high treason, they actually tried to elect a new leader and backbreaking labor to produce even a single ounce of dye. Tekhelet was violently expensive. It was the color of empires, to march them back to the chains of Egypt. God's response was definitive. That entire adult generation was sentenced to die in the wilderness. They would wander for 40 years until their bones turned to dust in the desert. They had rejected the inheritance, and now they would never see it. Then, the national crisis is immediately followed by a deeply personal one. In the very same chapter as the tassel command, a man is caught gathering wood on the Sabbath day. He is blatantly ignoring the covenant. He is brought outside the camp and stoned to death. Step back and look at what is happening. The covenant is shattering. The people are terrified, rebellious, and dying. They are trapped in a catastrophic cycle of forgetting God and trusting their own fears. And it is right here, in the immediate aftermath of failure, rebellion, and execution, that God stops the narrative to talk about clothing. He tells them to attach the blue thread. Why now? God explicitly states the reason in the text. It shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. Notice what God targets: the heart and the eyes. Those were the exact 2 things that had just destroyed the nation. It was woven into the robes of kings, the tapestries of palaces, and the garments of the untouchable elite. A common laborer would live his entire life. The spies saw the giants with their eyes, and their hearts failed them. They followed their own vision instead of God's promise. This context changes everything about how we view the blue cord. The tassels were not given as a reward for good behavior. They were not a badge of honor for a holy, obedient people. They were an emergency intervention for a people who could not stop forgetting who they were. When the Israelites looked down at their hems, they were not meant to feel a sense of self-righteous pride. They were meant to see a merciful anchor. God was saying, "You are wandering. You are forgetting. You are failing. So I am going to tie the reminder of your royal identity to the very clothes on your back." God did not respond to their rebellion by stripping away their identity. He responded by making it impossible for them to forget it. But how does a piece of string actually fix a wandering heart? What was it about this specific physical design that carried so much power? The answer requires looking closely at the specific Hebrew words God uses in the command, When we examine the original language, the physical object becomes a theological map. To understand the profound design of this object, we have to look closely at the exact Hebrew words Moses wrote down, without ever wearing a single thread of this blue. A slave could be killed just for possessing it. Now, leave the Mediterranean coast. In the English translation of Numbers 15, the command seems straightforward: make tassels on the corners of your garments. But the original language reveals a much deeper physical reality. Two specific Hebrew words anchor this verse, and both of them carried immense weight in the ancient world. The first is the word translated as tassel tzitzit. This was not a loose, frayed piece of string that happened to hang off the loom. The word fundamentally means a lock of hair, specifically an intentionally braided, tightly bound cluster. It required focused attention to create. The wearer had to deliberately twist and knot the thread, physically binding the commandment into their clothing. But it is the second word that changes the entire meaning of the garment. The English text tells the Israelites to attach this cord to the corners, or borders of their clothing. The Hebrew word used here is kanaf. The translation is accurate as a description of a garment's edge, but the original term carries an additional, deeply comforting sense. Its primary, foundational meaning is wing. The original audience would have heard a physical, living image. A bird uses its kanaf to fly, to shelter its young from predators, and to block the cold wind. Throughout the Old Testament, the kanaf, and travel into the barren heat of the Sinai desert. A nation of recently freed slaves is wandering through the dust, is a profound symbol of covenant protection and marriage. When Ruth, a destitute widow, sneaks down to the threshing floor, in the middle of the night, she asks Boaz to marry and redeem her with a very specific phrase: spread your wing, kanaf, over your servant. She is asking him to literally cover her with the corner of his garment, claiming his physical protection, his legal provision, and his name. Even more powerfully, this is the exact word God uses to describe his own relationship with Israel. He reminds them at Mount Sinai, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, kanaf, and brought you to myself." Later, the psalmist will write, "He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings, kanaf, you will find refuge." This linguistic detail completely rewrites how we view the ancient Israelites' clothing. When an Israelite stood in the desert dust, wearing the tzitzit on the kanaf of his robe, he was not simply wearing a rigid legalistic uniform. He was wearing a daily, physical reminder of the wings of God, the edges of his own ordinary clothing.